July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which charted a bold course for the new nation of the United States and declared that all men are created equal. Many Americans have struggled to make that promise a reality. In the latter half of the 20th century, many groups, including women, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, and the physically challenged, fought for equal rights. But it was the African American civil rights movement that led the way. Less than 20 years after the end of the Civil War, freed blacks in the South were subjected to a series of laws that legally separated the races in order to maintain white supremacy. Known as Jim Crow laws, they established the doctrine of separate but equal and effectively created two separate and unequal societies, one for whites, the other for blacks. Buses, restaurants, hotels, restrooms, even drinking fountains were segregated by race. One of the most devastating of these segregation laws created separate schools for blacks and whites in many states. Inadequate funding and poor conditions made black public schools invariably inferior to white public schools.
The white schools were getting the benefits of the taxes of the community, and they were much better funded than black schools. Black schools lacked equipment, they lacked good fields, they lacked new textbooks. Their teachers were paid less, the principals were paid less, and in general the facilities were a lot poorer than in white schools.
It wasn't until 1954 that the Supreme Court outlawed legal segregation in schools through the landmark Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka decision, which stated that separate could never be equal, and marked an important civil rights victory. Yet public areas remain segregated in many southern states. The Brown decision encouraged many African Americans in the South to challenge segregation laws in their own way. In 1955, a black woman named Rosa Parks was arrested after she refused to move to the black section in the back of a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This led to a massive boycott, as 17,000 blacks refused to ride the city buses. A year after the boycott began, a federal court struck down Alabama's law segregating public transportation. In January 1957, black ministers from across the South met in Atlanta, Georgia. Together they founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and elected Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as president. A passionate and moving speaker, Dr. King would emerge as the leader of the early civil rights movement.
We're going to stand up right here in Alabama.
King committed the organization to gaining civil rights for African Americans through nonviolent protests and civil disobedience. Despite the Brown decision, many white Southerners had made it clear they would resist desegregation, and in 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower had to use federal troops to enforce a federal court order to desegregate the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Still, it was clear that the winds of change were beginning to blow across the South. Vowing to follow Dr. King's call for nonviolence, 4 African-American college freshmen sat down at a whites-only lunch counter on February 1, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina. The students had staged one of the first sit-ins, a peaceful expression of their growing dissatisfaction with the slow pace of desegregation. The sit-in movement spread quickly to other southern cities, and most blacks remained committed to Dr. King's nonviolent tactics, even in the face of foul language, beatings, and arrests.
The police would use billy clubs and cattle prods, electric cattle prods that you would use on big animals to jab people. Not to respond to that, takes an awful lot of discipline, and it takes an awful lot of courage.
On May 4, 1961, a group of black and white protesters boarded 2 buses traveling from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Their goal was to integrate bus terminals on their ride through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. They called themselves Freedom Riders. White mobs and members of the Ku Klux Klan slashed tires and firebombed the buses. Freedom Riders were beaten. Many were arrested. What happened to the first few Freedom Riders, however, only seemed to encourage more protesters. It grew into a multiracial force of 1,000 and gave the movement important publicity. This helped force the Kennedy administration to order the Interstate Commerce Commission to stop segregation in interstate bus travel. During the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama gained a reputation for extreme violence against blacks who organized for civil rights and tried to cross the color line. In April 1963, in jail after being arrested for leading an unauthorized protest march on the Birmingham City Hall, Dr. King wrote what became known as his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, saying, "For years I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair." The protests continued. Led by the SCLC, a group of children gathered in Birmingham on May 2, 1963, for a peaceful demonstration protesting segregation. Within 3 hours, close to 1,000 children were jailed. The next day, more children demonstrated. Police ordered firefighters to use hoses to disperse them and mobilized dog units to attack them. That night, national news programs broadcast footage of white officials brutalizing black children. The nation was shocked and horrified. A few weeks later, President Kennedy appeared on television announcing that he would send Congress the most sweeping civil rights bill since the end of the Civil War.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
To push Congress into taking action on the bill, a group of civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people, black and white, from all over the country and from all walks of life, joined together in Washington to protest violence and discrimination in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the closing remarks, an address that came to be called the I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, with his civil rights bill still being debated in the House of Representatives. His death was a blow to the movement, but his successor, Lyndon Johnson, took up the cause and pressured the Congress to pass what became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This measure outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations and in the workplace, and tried to break down barriers to black voters in the Deep South.
I'm Idell Craft, and I'm working for the Board of Registration here in Greenwood.
The summer of 1964 became known as Mississippi Freedom Summer, as a diverse group of civil rights advocates tried to register black voters in Mississippi. Many whites in the state strongly resisted the effort. Some even resorted to violence, killing 3 young civil rights workers. In February 1965, a small voting rights march in Selma, Alabama, erupted in violence and ended in the death of a black activist. Outraged, civil rights advocates held another march on Sunday, March 7th. In an effort to stop the marchers, Governor George Wallace sent 200 state troopers armed with tear gas, nightsticks, and bullwhips. The violence was so severe that the event became known as Bloody Sunday. 2 weeks later, Martin Luther King Jr. organized another march from Selma to Montgomery. This time, though, President Johnson ordered National Guardsmen, Army troops, FBI agents, and U.S. Marshals to protect the marchers. At the end of the march, 25,000 people gathered on the steps of the Alabama state capitol to call for an end to voter discrimination. Later, in 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The legislation was designed to fight the persistent discrimination in voting in southern states. Results came quickly. In 1964, only 23% of eligible African American voters were registered in the South. By 1969, the number had almost tripled to 61%.